under this first area of helping our people connect this to our Christian faith. Of course, there's just places straight from the Bible where there is very direct teaching on these issues of power, vulnerability, abuse of power in some very profound ways. Another way is to think about how do we talk about our church mission, our priorities, our values. And of course, churches will use all kind of different ways to talk about, you can go to the next one, Bobby, our mission, our values, our identity. Some churches have very extensive statements about vision or mission or values or things like that. And some churches leave that more informal and don't formalize it. But whatever it is, however we talk about that, if I, worshiped with you guys and visited 3 or 4 times, I would hear some things, I bet, even in 3 or 4 visits that I would pick up on, okay, here's what this church is about. Here are the things they talk about and how the language they use around discipleship. Now, I've never had a church argue with me. It could happen today, maybe, but I doubt it. That one of our core why we exist as a church is the Great Commission, when Jesus in Matthew 28, after rising from the dead, says, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching to observe all that I've commanded you." Of course, here, when Jesus talks about making disciples, introducing people to know and worship and walk with God, he talks about baptism, he talks about walking in his teaching. Now, I would just say, I had a professor in seminary who said, it's like Matthew is finishing his gospel, inviting us to go back and read all that Jesus taught of how to walk as a disciple. Of course, that seems to be part of the goal of the structure of the book. Matthew has very distinct, teaching times where he has very extensive sections of Jesus' teaching. And we've already seen a lot of that in the verses we've already talked about, right? The teaching to not harm children, the promise of judgment for those who do harm children, the teaching to be not a wolf but a dove, but to be wise as a serpent, and to beware of one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and to love our neighbor, and that includes children, widows, the vulnerable. So this is a part of how the Bible talks about knowing God and walking with God. Let me just give you a few examples of that in the rest of the Bible. In Jeremiah, the leaders of Jeremiah's day were corrupt, and so God, through the prophet, calls out the corruption and abuses of power of the leaders. And he says, heaping oppression upon oppression, deceit upon deceit, these leaders, they refuse to know me, meaning they refuse to know God. Their refusal to know God was seen in how they treat and oppressed vulnerable people and how they abused power. There's other parts of Jeremiah where God points back a few generations to the, by and large, good king, Josiah, and it points out that Josiah cared about the poor, the needy, the vulnerable, essentially. That category, those categories of vulnerable people. And it says it this way, is this not what it means to know me? So knowing God in the Bible very often is connected directly to these issues of how we use power. That we use power to care for and protect, not exploit the vulnerable, but protect the vulnerable. Another passage that's powerful, do you remember the story of Eli and his sons, his wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas? Nobody names their kids Hophni or Phinehas, right? But it's at the beginning of Samuel, before there's a temple, there's just a tabernacle, and before there's a king. So this is like the highest, most powerful office in the whole country. And it's a spiritual office as well as a political one at this time, of course. And it talks about how Hophni and Phinehas were corrupt. They were corrupt in all sorts of ways, like stealing and taking funds and the offerings, taking parts they were not supposed to take. But it says this very blunt assessment that they were worthless men. And it talks about how they exploited the women who served at the tabernacle. Now, with our modern categories, what would you call this? When a pastor, the highest pastor in all the country, a political leader, a boss, over these, and we don't know, but likely, who were the women who were serving in the tabernacle? Who were families sending to serve in the tabernacle? Likely this is very young women. What is this? When a boss and a spiritual leader, the highest spiritual leader in all the country, is crossing sexual boundaries with likely very young women, what will we call this? Sexual abuse. That's what it is. With our modern categories, we would call this sexual abuse. It's an abuse of power, an abuse of authority. But notice the language the Bible uses is Hophni and Phinehas did not know the Lord. They did not know God. They didn't use power as God uses power. They used power corruptly for themselves. So again, just a couple of examples. But those who know God and walk with God prioritize protecting the vulnerable. That is a very clear theme in the scriptures. Now, sometimes I talk to leaders and they say things like, you can go to the next one, Bobby. Well, we're so glad you're here. We wanted to work on this. We know abuse could ruin our ministry or something like that. And I get really uncomfortable with that kind of statements because I want to say, whoa, hold on. And kind of where I started in this training, our focus has to be where? Where has God called us to place our focus as leaders? Of course, it's on people. Did Jesus give any sermons about how our reputation or like caring what people are saying about us? I mean, very little, if anything. Did he talk about protecting money or buildings? No, never. But he talked all the time about people and showed with his example. By the way, in the Gospels, if you look at the stories of Jesus interacting with people or individuals, who is he almost always interacting with? It's those categories of vulnerable people we mentioned. Women, children, widows, orphans, people who are sick, disabled, afflicted in some way, desperate in some way. That's the majority of the stories, because where are Jesus' priorities, right? And so look, again, as a former leader, there's no condemnation when we have meetings to talk about budgets and buildings and fixing the AC and all of those things. We have to take care of those things. But at the end of the day, if we fall into a rut where we're focused on the institution or the ministry, and that's our focus, we're in a rut. And we need to help each other get out of that rut, because that's not the priority. That's not the priority of Jesus. All right, the next area, the Bible, so you can go to the next one, Bobby. The next area where I would say the Bible very directly teaches, there's just so much, is the issue of power. Now, I've already mentioned a couple of places already, but let's do the third scenario. And here's another good scenario where there's no abuse, so take a deep breath. But this is an important exercise, I believe, for us as leaders. Here is a description of a pastor, a good pastor who does not abuse power. But here's the question I want you to focus on. As I read this, and we're just going to do this one all together, what types of power does this pastor, Pastor Mark, hold? He holds a lot of power. So let's just name some of the types of power that he holds. So I'll read it, and we'll talk. So Mark is a good pastor. He does not abuse his power. Pastor Mark graduated seminary with honors. He is pursuing a PhD. He is beloved in his church for his sense of humor, his kindness, and willingness to help. He gives skillful sermons that challenge and encourage his flock. He is average height, but his personality and presence can fill up a room. He is not afraid to speak about his own humanity and share about his own faith struggles. Many in the church view him as an extension of their family. All right, what types of power do you see? What types of power does Mark hold? What would you say?
Trust.
Sorry? Trust, yeah. What else? Education, yeah, as a form of power, gives him power. What else? Yeah, there's a type of power that we could call a power of personality. He's very charismatic. He can draw the attention of the room and maintain the attention of the room. Okay? What else? Leadership, yeah. And he's a formal leader, right? So you can have someone with leadership qualities that's a more informal, but then he has a formal role of leadership. He has a position of pastor. He's clergy. Yeah, absolutely. What else? That's right. He has relational power. I would say trust, like you said over here, is often related to that. When people see you're trustworthy, you get a lot of power relationally because people see you're honest, you're transparent, you're worthy of trust. Absolutely. So do you see that there are types of power that are more formal? Position, education, credentials. And then there are more informal types of power. Relational, emotional, spiritual, some of those ones we mentioned. Personality. And, all of us have some level of power in those areas, maybe in some of those categories, maybe not all. But certainly someone like Mark, he has all of those types of power all at the same time. That gives him just a tremendous amount of power in the lives of others. And I have in the slides here an exercise about self-reflection, about the power that we hold. So we're not going to do this now, but it's in the slides, and I would encourage you to go back in a week or two or three and do this, maybe individually or with a colleague. But just ask some of these types of questions. What types of power do I hold? Just do an inventory using some of the things. And by the way, if you wanted to get Diane Langberg's book, Redeeming Power, it's really helpful for talking about those categories I mentioned. But just doing a little self-reflection. What types of power do I hold? What does it look like when I use my power for good to serve others? And then if I started to use my power in ways that were a little more self-centered, what might that look like? I just think it's so critical for us as leaders to be healthy people, healthy leaders, safe leaders, to be more self-aware of the power we hold in the lives of others, and to be very consciously aware of how we are deliberately using power in the way of Jesus, the way that Jesus calls us to use power. So for one, when we do have a formal power position, we as organizations do well to understand that type of formal position, pastor, church staff, supervisor, boss, counselor, mentor, those types of formal roles with formal power, that brings a ton of responsibility, right? To use our power only to help those under our authority. And it's an abuse of power with someone under that formal power to cross a sexual boundary, for example, or to, manipulate them. That's a really serious abuse of power. In the Bible, when Jesus uses that language again of wolf and shepherd and sheep, you remember in John 10 where Jesus said, I am the good shepherd lays down my life for the sheep. And he says, when the wolf comes, the good shepherd steps in the way and stops the wolf from getting to the more vulnerable sheep. He's talking about the role of a good shepherd, a good leader, and he's borrowing that language from the prophets, Ezekiel 34, Jeremiah 23. In those prophetic contexts, do you know what's happening? The leaders, the shepherds, are doing what? They're using the people for their own selfish purposes, their own corrupt purposes. And so Jesus when he says, I am the good shepherd, guess what he's talking about? He's talking about that true leaders, good leaders, godly leaders, do not abuse power, but use power for the sake of others. That's his fundamental core point. The prophetic passages he's drawing upon make that plain. I think it's even plain in the context. But the further context of where he's drawing that language from makes it abundantly clear. And then, by the way, the New Testament writers pick up on that language. When they talk about being a good elder, a good pastor, guess the language they use very often? Shepherding and being shepherds, because they're getting at what Jesus said about using power to protect and care for. And that's the heart of what it means to be a leader in the way of Jesus. Jesus also said in Matthew 28, after he rose from the dead, he said famously, all authority, all power is given to me. So this is something we can help our people understand. As leaders, we can help our people in church understand. Jesus says all authority, all power belongs to him in heaven and on earth. The point of that Hebrew, heaven and earth, it's everything. That's what it means. Now, all of us hold power. But as Christians, what is our fundamental conviction? Who is Lord? Who is King of Kings? Who is Lord of all? Jesus. So any power we hold, who does it belong to? Does it belong to us? Nope, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Jesus. So what that means is any power we hold in our homes, in the church, in our relationships, in our work, wherever, that power as Christians, we know we're only holding that power as a steward. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Jesus, which means the only legitimate use of that power for us as Christians, the only legitimate use of power is to use it in the way of Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. That's a powerful, positive Christian vision and view of power that we can disciple people with, that we can help them think about their lives and how they use relational power, emotional power, verbal power in their homes and in their work and in their relationships and in the church and other forms of power as well. Jesus rebuked the disciples famously in Mark 10. Do you remember the passage? Where they were so excited. Oh, Jesus is going to be the Messiah and recognized, and he's going to be the king. We're going to be right up there with him, and everyone's going to see us holding power, and we're going to get to hold power. And they were so excited, but Jesus said, stop it. Stop it, because you're thinking about power the way the world thinks about power. You think about power as being able to tell people what to do and benefit from holding the power, benefit yourself. And Jesus said it's actually the opposite. Power is to be used to serve other people, to lay down your life for people, to protect people, to bless them. That is what power is for. And so Jesus, he was an exemplar of that, and he calls us to that in his teaching over and over. So as leaders, we have to be exemplars of that. We have to model that and be safe and trustworthy and transparent. We drive a safe and healthy culture by having this view of power ourselves. And we can't outsource protecting people. We have to do it. We have to do that hard work as leaders because we hold the most power in the system. And, we can present this. You can go on, Bobby. Go on a couple, actually. Yep. And the next one. There you go. But here's the thing. We can use this vision ourselves to be self-reflective about the power we hold and how we use it. But again, I would encourage you to think about how can we present this to our people as a tool of discipleship, as a major category. Because power, again, is so amazingly and deeply addressed in the Bible in really profound ways. And we can give examples that will help our people understand what God is calling us to in our use of power. So we set the tone because we hold the most power as leaders. So that really matters. But again, it has to be, we're calling the whole community to get on board with Jesus's, this view of power as Jesus gives it to us, right? To be safe leaders ourselves, but to call others to be safe in how they're using power in our words, in our homes, in our relationships. And again, and I only gave you a few passages, right? There's so many more places where we could draw that out from the Bible. All right. We're going to come back to accountability, but leaders, just since we're talking about power, part of being a good godly leader is we have to establish pathways for holding those who hold power accountable. So we're going to come back to that in the last part of the framework. Okay. You can go to, Bobby, the slide with the framework on it. It's one or two away. Yep. All right. Before I rush on to education, does that first part of the framework make sense to you? Do you see that gives us a powerful foundation, and that will drive us and allow us to do the other parts of it? Because we know this is right. We know this is not something separate from our Christian faith. This is at the heart of our Christian faith, right? All right. Does anyone have a thought you want to share with the group? Just something you're thinking about, something you're excited about, a question before we continue on? I'll just take a beat for a second. All right, I'm going to keep going. With education, there's 4 areas I want to talk about under this heading. So we'll start to go a little faster, you'll notice. I think if we get that first section right, the others will follow. But the first area under education is to recognize education is not always starting from a place of neutrality. Sometimes people have attitudes of denial regarding abuse, or they've ingested some myths or misinformation about abuse. So it's important that we're aware that there are some stubborn attitudes of denial in the church. And I'm not trying to call out churches. This is everywhere, by the way. There are attitudes of denial about abuse in families and in any organization or type of institution. So it's not just churches, but as leaders, we know these attitudes of denial, like, well, that would just never happen here. Our church is so wonderful. Well, yes, your church is wonderful. Like, I don't know you guys that well, but of course you're a wonderful church. You have so many wonderful people here. It doesn't mean a bad actor couldn't also be here, though. It's the same in my church. I have a wonderful church in Lynchburg, Virginia. But that doesn't mean there couldn't be a bad actor. So we have to get over those attitudes of denial. It would never happen here. It would never happen in my family, my neighborhood, my town, things like that, my church. When I was a pastor, I read a news story about a pastor in my own denomination. He abused multiple minors, and he was a worship leader in a church in a pretty large city. Not my own city, but because it was my own denomination, it caught my attention more than most stories. And I read the reporting around it. And in one of the news stories, they interviewed a congregant once he was arrested and it became public. And she said, look, this is shocking. It's shocking because this was my worship leader for 4 or 5 years or something. And she said, this is shocking because this is someone who I thought was good, who was a good leader. And can you relate to that? Of course, I can. Of course that would be shocking. Jesus, when he talked about beware of a wolf in sheep's clothing, he's not saying, hey, when you figure out someone you thought was a good person, was a wolf in sheep's clothing, of course, that's hard, that's difficult. So I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be sensitive to that. Of course, we should. At the same time, though, the attitude that we see, you can go to the next one, Bobby. The attitude we see sometimes is, well, wait, I know that person. I just don't believe that they could have done that. That type of attitude, that's where we do bear a responsibility as leaders to help people process through those understandable but potentially harmful types of expressions, right? And, as leaders, we're not to be immediately pronouncing as a judge what has happened when an allegation comes to light, or to be an investigator. That's just not our role. However, as a spiritual leader in a community, when someone says, oh, that can't be true because they never did that to me, or I never saw them do that, or they don't seem like the type of person, we want to have already done some work, but certainly it might be appropriate, again, depending on the context and the conversation, to be able to say to them, what? Well, Jesus actually talked about this exact situation where someone we thought would never do this actually has done this. So we shouldn't immediately say, I don't believe that. And, of course, it would be different when we talk to an individual who's disclosing. When we do the congregation-based training, by the way, 1/4 of that will be spent on how do we care for someone, and what do we say if someone in our church or anywhere trusts us with their story? What do you say? What do you not say? So we're going to come back to that issue in more depth. But just from a leadership perspective, this will be one example of an attitude of denial where we might have an opportunity to speak into that and help someone process through that attitude of denial. Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Do you guys have any principles of disclosure when you're thinking communication? A situation has come up, somebody's done a thing, how much do you say? And those people are like, well, there's no way. I like that, what you said about Jesus warned us this would happen, but, but what happened?
So as a leader, in the immediate, when the immediacy of that, the policy that your team's working on will help you. Because you can say, look, here's what we're doing, but also we know these areas are not our role. Like, we're not investigating this. We're not trained to do forensic interviews. None of us are trained to do that, right? That's just not our role. So you can tell people here, we're following our policy, we're taking this seriously. At the same time, of course, if there's going to be formal accountability, there has to be a process. Every survivor knows this, by the way. They understand there has to be a thorough process. So that's where you can, the policy will help with that a great deal, yeah. And we'll come back to this issue of leadership response at the end of the training today.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, just to say, yeah, go ahead.
What about maybe kind of the opposite response to
Yeah.
this, where you're example of the worship leader, like people coming forward and saying, like, we should have known, we should have taught this, we should have seen through him.
Yeah.
Like, I believe his lies. Like,
Yeah.
is that real guilt? Is that false guilt? How do you kind of navigate some of that?
Yeah, so it's normal to have a processing and an assessing in that scenario, right? And it all depends on the situation. There are plenty of situations where there were things that should have been caught, but there are plenty where there's no warning, and a seemingly faithful Christian dad or mom, we learned some really hidden things, and none of us saw it coming. And maybe the other spouse feels super guilty, like, how in the world did I miss this? But there just isn't, there are some explanations for why we sometimes miss things. So we just have to take each situation on its own. And we have to be wise as leaders to say, yes, we do want to do that processing work, to ask, can we improve? Can we get better at seeing things sooner? Of course, we want to work on that. But there are so many situations where, we didn't see it coming. because someone's very deceptive, very manipulative. That is also the case very often. So, yeah, sorry I don't have a great, simple answer to that. But we do have to take each case on its own. We do have to ask and process. And that's an individual thing, but it's also a system leadership issue. Yeah. There are some common abuse myths. Now, Bobby, you can go to the next one. Down to yeah. So, look, there are things that we'll address in our training for your congregation that work against some of these, but there might be some you as a church, just do a little time. Here's another exercise I've kind of built into the slides to ask yourselves as leaders, what are some of the more important forms or common forms of denial or myths, and sometimes it's not myths or denial, sometimes it's just cultural things that are kind of church culture things, like don't gossip. Well, no, of course not. The Bible says don't gossip. But in the Bible, what is gossip? It's not just talking about a concern. Is it, if someone sees a policy violation out in the hallway, is it gossip to go tell someone about it? That's actually not at all what the Bible means by gossip. It's very specific in the Bible. Gossip is an intentional lie to try to tear someone down. That's what gossip is in the Bible. Now, in our day and age, we use that word much more broadly to talking about a new relationship that this person's in, and that's gossip, right? Or talking about someone when they're not present, that's gossip. But in a church setting, you have people who are very reluctant to say something, and we're very often guarded with our words, of course. Absolutely. I'm all for being careful with our words and using discretion, but we do have to work against the mentality that, oh, I assume the best if they're violating our policy because I kind of know that guy, and I'll just assume he has good motives, and it won't be a big deal. Well, that's not going to get us where we need to go. If someone is violating the policy, they do need to talk about it with a leader so that we can reinforce the safe boundary we've agreed upon, right? That really matters. So, again, what are important forms of denial or cultural beliefs or myths? And then, what might keep you from addressing those? So those are good questions to kind of process through as a leadership team. And again, the main point of this section is we're not always meeting people to educate them on these issues in a place of neutrality or starting from zero. Often they're in a place of we need to address some denial and myths and cultural beliefs that can get in the way of what we're asking of them and playing a role in our community of contributing to prevention. All right. Now, once we, of course, meet them there, we do want to bring them into a place of education. So having a plan for education really matters. The safest community, and I would just say the practical thing you can do, the one practical thing every church can do to almost immediately help raise the level of safety is by bringing some education to these issues. By just bringing it out in the open and having conversation, that helps us so much. So we encourage churches to have a plan, a 3-year plan or whatever, a 5-year plan or even a 1-year plan. What are we doing with education? Now, as a part of this process with us, as I mentioned, we already have a big educational event on the horizon to do the safeguarding training we've developed for the whole church community. We do want to educate kids about these issues. And, we have some recommended books. We have a guide about how to give a safety talk. We're going to be, once we kind of finish the policy, we'll be talking with you guys directly about that, how we approach it. With elementary age kids, there are so many good books now that you can just read to them and then encourage parents to do the same at home. And so I would encourage you, get some of these books, put them out on your book tables, encourage parents, if you have the church budget, give them to new parents, things like that. Promote this. And then do regular safety talks with students and with elementary age kids. It really makes a difference. It socializes kids into how they should be treated by adults, by their peers, by older kids, and it socializes them into how they treat their peers and how they treat younger kids. So much unhealthy interaction is not just directed at children from adults, but also other minors. And even abuse itself, a significant amount of abuse itself, is perpetrated against minors by other minors. So in our safeguarding training with the congregation, we will mention this issue and talk about it in some more depth, but it's such an important issue, I wanted to bring it up here for you as leaders. Now, it's good in our opinion to, as a church, to alternate having some outside experts do trainings and doing internal trainings yourself. So like this training, I'm giving you tons of ways you can take this and speak to your people about it. Now, you're not going to do a 4-hour training. That's fine. Don't worry about it. You can do a 20-minute training, though. You can do a 30-minute training, some of you. When you use your internal voice, that matters because people are hearing you and they know you. And they're going to see you here week by week by week. That's really powerful. And it's when we pair that with having outside expertise, I think that really gets traction with training in churches. So we're not the only ones who are experts on these issues. Right here in your local area, you could invite a Christian trauma counselor. You could invite someone from a child advocacy center. You could invite someone from a domestic violence shelter. You can invite someone from a sexual assault center to come and speak to these issues. Now, don't do that all in 1 year. It's too much for people. That's why a 3-year plan is a good plan. Have an outside expert like once a year or something like that, and go at a pace, and then supplement that, not supplement, but pair that with your internal briefings on your policy, internal trainings that are a little more that you feel like you can do and grow your voice with. And again, that pairing really, I think, will help you get traction. There are some barriers to having trainings, and some of those are organizational and some of those are individual, is one way to structure that. For us as leaders for organization, sometimes it's a matter of just making the time and investing the time and cost to bring in trainers or put some resources toward it. Of course, there are all sorts of other worthy things we have to give our attention to. At the same time, I've just made the case that this is a part of our faith and should be a part of our priorities, right? And so we have to have a plan for training that it's repeated. And, sometimes leaders are like, well, if we talk about it, do people think we've got it? Again, those are things we can all work through. The logistics, the perception of what that means when we're committed to this. We can figure out and work through that as leaders. And then individual barriers. For people who are just so busy and they don't want to set aside time to come out on a Saturday or a Sunday to do a training, we can make an appeal to them that is grounded in our Christian faith. When someone is like, well, I don't work with the students or the nursery, so why would I have to come? Well, because this impacts everybody, and everybody contributes to our community being a place of safety, place of respect. That really matters, that we can make the case for it and say, hey, this isn't just for staff, this isn't just for volunteers who work with kids, this is for everybody. Our community is a safer community when all of us have practical education and skills in these areas. And it really makes a difference. So, as leaders, just be aware of those issues as you prepare for trainings, as you plan this out. You can overcome those barriers. All right. Within education, and by the way, if you have a question like you're doing, keep raising your hand, interrupt, ask, please do. Encourage it. There are a couple of specific areas of education that we think really make the difference, and that's understanding some education related to survivors and also offenders. So I just want us to take some time and talk about that. And for survivors, let me just say this. So, yeah. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember that story in Luke 10? Famous story of Jesus. Do you remember what prompted the story? There was a man, he thought, I am fantastic at loving God and loving neighbor. And he wanted to justify himself and show everybody he was very proud of it, right? So he challenges Jesus with that question, and who is my neighbor? Because in his own mind, he had done it, and he was approved by God. So to challenge this man, to help this man, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And so to answer the question, what does it really mean to love God, love neighbor? And who is the neighbor, by the way, that we're called to love? He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So he tells a story of someone who is assaulted. Have you ever thought about that story in that way? I mean, I think that should just stop us in our tracks for a second as Christians. To get to the heart of the issue, what does it mean to love our neighbor? And who is the neighbor we're called to love? Jesus says, well, imagine someone's abused, someone is assaulted and left for dead. And the religious person sees them, looks the other way, crosses to the other side of the road, and keeps going and leaves the man there. And then the priest, the pastor of the day, does the same thing, looks the other way, ignores his cry, crosses to the other side of the road, keeps going. But the Good Samaritan, of course, the Samaritans were despised, we know, by the audience Jesus was talking to, right? So it's a reversal in that way too, challenging their racism, essentially. He stops, he binds up the man's wounds, and at his own personal cost, takes him to a place where he can get ongoing care before hospitals, right? And says, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Now, most days, we don't confront someone who's been assaulted and they're talking to us about their story. That's not our experience every day. But I think it's just so profound that when Jesus wanted to get to the heart of what it means to love our neighbor and to challenge this man who thought, I'm going to make this manageable, I've done it, no problem. Jesus says, yeah, but what about caring for people who've been abused? And I mean, I just will never get over that. Now, again, that's not our everyday life or experience for most of us. And all of us have limited resources and time. And as a church, we have limited resources and time. But certainly, what is Jesus calling us to? As we're able, as someone comes to us and says, I've been hurt, I need help. He's calling us to love in that way. I just think that's so profound. So for survivors and understanding these issues, I mentioned in the safeguarding training, we're going to spend a whole fourth of the training on that. But to us, it's such a critical issue that I want to bring up a few things about that here with you. So a few things on the next slide. We as leaders must get these core issues. It's good for us to understand some basics about trauma and what trauma is and how it impacts people. So I'm going to say a few words about that in a moment. We have to understand why many victims do not come forward. That's just a common dynamic with abuse. Many never come forward. They're just not ever in a place where they want to talk about their story. That's understandable. That's okay. Some delay decades, years and decades before they talk about their story. What we have to understand as leaders is that it's never okay for us to say something like, why didn't you come forward? Or why didn't you come forward immediately? That can be, again, it's not usually our intention, but that can be adding more to the burden of shame and blame they are already carrying. And so for us as leaders, again, if we just stop for a second and think about it, and leaders have said those things to survivors. That's why I bring it up. When we think about it with what we've said about what abuse is and the common dynamics, think about what we're saying when we say, why didn't you come forward? You were just hurt and betrayed by someone who you have a relationship with, who holds power and trust in your life. And we are somehow suggesting that, oh, you should just immediately, easily make yourself vulnerable again and come forward to someone who has power and trust in your life. When we think about it in those categories like we've talked about in defined abuse, we start to understand, oh, that can be incredibly difficult because someone has been hurt by often, almost always, someone holding power and trust in their life. And it would be very difficult for them to, in a place of being very hurt, again, open themselves up and make themselves vulnerable to come forward to someone holding power and trust. So we have to get that as leaders. We have to get those dynamics. And we have to help our people. So that's why we spend a whole fourth of the training on it, is because you are not the only ones who are going to have people come to you and trust you with their story. It could be, people open up to their friends, their parents, someone they volunteer alongside at church. We don't know who that's going to be. But we just want to work on those practical skills in a church setting such that if a person does come forward, everyone knows that's not a good thing to say. And we can have some of those thoughts. We're humans. Why did you go to their house so late? It doesn't matter. That's not the thing to ask or say at that point, right? We need to avoid the classic victim-blaming responses. And I'll tell you, it's normally not said out of malice. We're not trying to hurt people. But often when we do say it, and it's, again, why did you go there? Why did you go so late? Did you text them first? All the classics, right? We could name them. What were you wearing? Were you drinking? All of those things. As leaders, we need to understand those are not the things we say in that moment. So again, we're going to work on that, and you'll be there with everybody. So we're going to do a lot more work on that. But it's really important that we continue to keep that, as leaders, a focus and a priority, that we never blame or minimize someone's experience. Now, the issue of believing, I understand, is a little bit fraught, because you'll hear people say, make black and white statements, like, we believe all victims. Well, what about false allegations? Well, false allegations, statistically, we know, are actually fairly rare. Like, they do occur, but it's a very small percentage. But I would never tell anyone they'd never occur. They do. So when we say things like believe victims, or it's important that we believe a victim, here's the way I would frame it for you, and I hope this is helpful for you. When someone opens up to us about their story, it is important that we say things like, I am so sorry. That should not have happened to you. When I was a pastor, I had people open up to me because they saw me talking about these issues. They saw that I cared. So I actually had many people disclose to me from my own church when I was a pastor. It would not have done for me to say to them in that disclosure moment, well, if that did happen to you, I am very sorry. Of course not. That would have been devastating because I'm communicating, I'm not here for you, I'm skeptical of this, I don't believe you, potentially. I don't need to say that. That's not helpful, that's harmful. I need to say, I am so sorry. And I do know statistically, the vast majority of those people are telling me the truth. But here's also why I say it. I say it because my role in that conversation is to be there for that person and communicate support. I am not an investigator. I'm not one anyway, but especially in that conversation, and if you are in that conversation, or anyone in your church, you are not a judge, you are not a jury, you are not an investigator. I hope that distinction helps, right? So when we say things like, well, what about a presumption of innocence? Well, that's in a criminal courtroom. That's the context for that. And there are rules in that courtroom for due process and standards of evidence and a presumption of innocence. And all those things apply in a courtroom because the goal in that is to have a fair process, which we all know is a goal. It's aspirational, right? It doesn't often occur. Or in many cases, it doesn't occur. But in that conversation, we're not in a courtroom. And a church, by the way, is not a courtroom either. And our role is not investigator or judge or jury. So that's why we say things like believe someone if they open up to you about their story. That's what we're talking about, is taking a supportive posture. Because our role in that moment is not investigator, judge, or jury. And as I said, all survivors know if there's going to be formal accountability, at least all survivors we've met over the years at Grace, they all know if there's going to be formal accountability in the church or in a courtroom, that there has to be a process, and a thorough process, of course. But does that distinction make sense to you? That's why we say things like, we say, I'm so sorry. We take a believing posture. Because we're not the investigator, that's not our job in that moment. Does that help? Does anyone have a question, or anyone want to? Mike, you're crazy. It's okay. You cannot offend me, and I'm glad to talk through anything like that. Yes?
If someone is opening up to you about their story, is it then considered harmful to ask questions on the details of that story in the moment, or just to purely be listening?
So I'm going to repeat it for the recording. If someone opens up to you about their story, is it okay to ask questions about the details? We're going to address that in the safeguarding training with everybody, but I'll give you a quick answer here because it's important. It's fine to ask open-ended questions. That's the key. To say, do you want to tell me more? Or do you want to tell me who did this? To press them for details when they're clearly not comfortable is usually harmful. We shouldn't do that. But it's okay to ask those open-ended questions where we're not pressuring them, and make it even clear. Like, you have permission to, do you want to tell me more about this, or do you want to talk more? But, and what especially we want to avoid, especially with a child, certainly with an adult as well, we don't want to ask leading questions like, was it Will who did this to you? Did they touch you in this way? Did they do this? Especially with children, younger children especially, we don't put information or ideas into their head when they have not brought it up. That can contaminate the trauma in their memory and how they've stored the memories of what happened in unhelpful ways. And it can make CPS and law enforcement much harder for them to do their jobs well, a forensic interviewer to do their job well. So that's the short answer. We'll say more about it. Yeah, really good question. Okay. Yeah.
To answer your question, I think it is helpful to frame legally victims and taking a supportive tone and posture in that. But what if they did press you for specific actions that you're not necessarily comfortable with at that time? Like, well, if you really believe me, then you do this.
Yeah, of course.
You church and tell everyone, or
Yeah, I would tell you, so I would tell you if someone out of that general idea of taking a believing, supporting posture, which we should take, then you must do this specific thing. As leaders, you always have to look at that and follow your conscience. And I will tell you, there are things survivors have asked us to do that we don't feel like we can do in our organization. And so we have to follow our conscience, and we exist for the very purpose of helping these issues and ultimately helping survivors as well as preventing abuse and helping churches respond well. But that is a situation that does occur, where someone is asking you to do something you don't feel, and sometimes it's not always right or wrong, you just don't feel it's wise or helpful to do something at this time. And sometimes one survivor is asking you to do something, another survivor is saying, please don't do that. And so it can be, the real world is complicated. So as leaders, we have to look at each situation, and we have to use all the wisdom God has given us and pray. And we would say, call us. We'll help you think through what to do if you have a specific question. And sometimes it gets to, when do you communicate with the whole congregation? Well, many times we've told a church, look, in general, it's often good to communicate in certain cases, but there's a time not to communicate either, because law enforcement doesn't want you to. They want to investigate this without the person being tipped off. So there are times to not say something also, and it can be complex. So that's why we would encourage independent consultation in certain cases, where you feel that tension of you're not sure what's best on a practical issue. Yeah, good question. All right, SAMHSA is our U.S. substance abuse. SAMHSA is our Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have a wonderful summary document about trauma. Bobby and Lindsay have a copy of this in a Google Drive folder we've shared with them. And in addition to that, so that is a 30-page summary about what trauma is and how to take a trauma-informed approach. I just think it's 30 pages of pure gold for any leader in an organization. And they talk about being a trauma-informed organization in terms of just realizing trauma is widespread. And trauma just doesn't occur only from abuse, by the way. Someone who is in a terrible car accident has gone through something traumatic. About half of people at some point in their life will go something very acutely traumatic. And so for us, these are the people, again, in our church, in your church and mine. And so just knowing that is widespread, knowing signs and symptoms, trouble sleeping and nightmares or panic attacks, things like that are often rooted in trauma. And our brain, we'll talk on a lay level about this with everybody in the safeguarding training. Our brain is often the ability after trauma to regulate feeling safe and being able to stay calm when there's a threat. The ability to regulate those systems of keeping ourselves safe when there's a threat and then calming back down, that can get disrupted by trauma. So just knowing that and knowing some of the signs that someone has trauma is impacting them can really help us as a church. And then we want to integrate a knowledge of trauma into our policies. Things like putting safety as a priority in our policy. That's a trauma-informed principle. So on the next slide, there are 6 trauma-informed principles of care in that document. And our executive director at Grace, Pete Singer, he is a clinical social worker. He's done therapy for years with children and adults who have suffered abuse and other traumas. And Pete has written an article where he shows these 6 principles of trauma-informed care from SAMHSA are in the Bible all the time, as priorities in the Bible all the time. And so his article will help you all have a framework for trauma that is integrated with our Christian faith and our Christian faith priorities. And so for someone who has experienced abuse, to know that the first thing they need is to reestablish a sense of safety. Physical safety, spiritual safety, and other psychological safety. That's just really important. And transparency, and when abuse has broken, a betrayal, a deep betrayal, that when we respond with being worthy of trust and having integrity and being transparent as far as we're able to, that really matters. Connecting someone with peers who've had a similar experience can be very helpful in caring for someone who's been faced a trauma. Collaboration and mutuality just means we share power, and those who have a stake get to speak into what we're going to do and what's going to happen. That as leaders, we don't just mandate on high how it's going to go, but we collaborate and share power. And we encourage the reestablishing where, because in abuse, power is taken away and someone's voice and agency is silenced, that we encourage them to reestablish their God-given agency that should be respected, and their voice that should be listened to, that they have choices to make in their life that God wants them to make. That's all very, very healthy. So again, Pete's article, I mentioned it, we're going to come back to this issue in the safeguarding training, but Pete's article, if you're interested, will give you a window into going deeper on this. And I would say this is just, again, I think it's pure gold for helping us go deeper in how we pastorally care for people. And again, a way that's connected to our Christian faith, but's connected to an evidence-based approach of understanding what trauma is. And so I just highly, highly commend it. I think it'll be helpful for you. I will say that in the church, a church community is essential for so many for healing. And as a Christian, it just warms my heart when I read secular books on trauma and they say, there is no healing without a support system. A survivor of abuse or trauma can't heal without a support system, without a caring community. And then they say things, and I'm like, it sounds like they're talking about a church. That's amazing. And that is absolutely essential. That's how we're wired as humans. That's how God made us. We cannot feel safe ultimately unless we're connected to each other, unless we're in loving, caring relationships. That's just how humanity works. So churches, we can be an essential part of healing for survivors. And so in the safeguarding training, we're going to develop those skills of being sensitive, of what to say, what not to say. That'll really help the whole community in that regard. At the same time, as a pastor, if someone came to me and said, Mike, I'm having trouble with my spine, can you help me? I would not have, back when I was a pastor, cleared off my desk and said, all right, buddy, get up here and let me just get in there and see what we can do, or if I can tell what the problem is. Of course not. I have no formal training. I'm not a doctor. And that would be foolish, potentially illegal, I don't know, all sorts of things. In the church, pastors and leaders, we give support and pastoral counseling all the time, and that's a part of our role. Amen. But I am not qualified to treat someone who's having nightmares and flashbacks from trauma, because that's an issue of their brain and their body, and there are professionals who have training with that. By the way, many of them are Christians. I work with some of them who are trained to work on that. Grace's board chair, Laura Teen, that's what she does. Pete Singer, our executive director, that's what he did for years. So it's not an issue of send them to those secular counselors. No, that's not what I'm saying. But recognize when there is a need for professional licensed mental health care and health care. It's a both and both are essential. So that's our take. End of sermon. You're free to make that a point of controversy. And I just have a couple summary slides here of being a supportive community. I'm not going to walk through these in detail because this is coming in the safeguarding training, but they're just here for your reference. And if you're interested or you want to talk about them, certainly we can. All right, we are at our time for lunch. Are we good, Lindsay, Bobby, on that? Okay. So yes. No, you're good.
Because if we're moving on from education, we have a lot of teens who
Yeah.
serve in
Yeah.
camps.
Yes.
So do you leave that to the, youth leaders to train them, or do
Yeah.
you pull them into these trainings?
So I would say teens, like high school age, we often have churches say, can the teenagers come to the safeguarding training? And we say, we are glad for them to come. In our view, again, we don't put intentionally shocking, graphic things in it. So it's not usually an issue of appropriateness for their age. But we always want to make sure you guys know it's your call as a church, and it's ultimately, we know, a parent's call if their minor child attends a training like that. So we can certainly make it available and know that some parents will be fine with it and some won't, and that's totally fine, no problem. What we can do and should do with all the teenagers, including the ones who serve, is make sure we give a safety talk every so often with the student ministry. And if you do a little briefing on the policy for all the volunteers, having them there, great. I think that's wonderful too. Yeah. That's how I would approach it. Good question. All right. Lindsay, do you want to tell us what to do?